We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident.
Actually, it's interesting. Sounds rather sort of bizarre, but I did go to Diana's coffin.
Exactly 28 years later, when Charles Spencer opened Princess Diana's tomb to save the sinking sanctuary, he got shocked by an impossible, heart-stopping discovery waiting for him in the dark. As the 9th Earl, Charles had spent nearly 3 decades as the fierce, grieving protector of the Althorp estate, standing guard over a sacred island that the world was never meant to breach. He expected to find nothing more than the solemn, undisturbed silence of his beloved sister's eternal rest beneath the heavy limestone. But as the massive stones finally shifted, exposing the sealed burial vault to the autumn sunlight, the site resting perfectly in the center of her lead-lined casket wasn't a symbol of peaceful slumber. It was a deliberately placed, tarnished silver lockbox that shattered the illusion of her solitary isolation. How did a secret artifact bypass the most heavily guarded, impenetrable security on Earth? Who risked everything to plant it there in the chaotic, grief-stricken hours before the final seal was cast? And what devastating final truth was waiting inside that box, about to completely rewrite the tragic legacy of a princess? The morning air over the Althorp estate was usually defined by an impenetrable, sacred silence. For 28 years, that silence had been the ultimate protector of the Oval Lake. But today, the crispness of the autumn air was violently shattered by the grinding, guttural hum of industrial excavators tearing into the earth. It was a mechanical intrusion that made Charles Spencer's chest tighten with dread. Standing at the muddy edge of the water, the 9th Earl Spencer pulled his heavy wool coat closer against the biting chill. He watched the massive machinery inching across the temporary pontoon bridge toward the island. He never wanted this day to arrive. Since September 1997, his sister's resting place had been an untouchable sanctuary. But nature possessed no reverence for royalty, legacy, or tragedy. The ancient retaining walls that held the island together were structurally failing. Water from the lake was seeping into the foundational earth, threatening to breach the outer sanctuary and submerge the burial vault completely. To save the tomb, they had no choice but to open it. "We are in position, Lord Spencer," a voice called out over the roar of the engines. It was David, the lead structural engineer. His face was pale, reflecting the immense gravity of what they were about to execute. "We will lift the outer limestone slab, just enough to assess the water damage to the vault's shell. We only need a few minutes." Charles nodded tightly, his jaw clenched. He vividly remembered the day those massive stones were originally laid. He remembered the suffocating worldwide grief, the endless sea of floral tributes, and the solemn vow he had made to shield Diana from the relentless, invasive eyes of the world. Now, by a cruel twist of fate, he was the one ordering the stones to be moved. The crane's engine roared louder, black diesel smoke puffing into the overcast gray sky. Thick, heavy-duty nylon straps tightened around the massive limestone cap covering the outer vault. With a sickening, ancient groan of stone scraping against stone, the heavy lid slowly lifted from its resting place. Charles held his breath. He expected to see the cold, undisturbed, lead-lined coffin, resting exactly as it had for nearly 3 decades in absolute darkness. Instead, the crane abruptly stopped. David, standing at the very edge of the breach, threw his hand frantically into the air, signaling the operator to cut the engines entirely. The sudden silence that fell over the lake was deafening. "Lord Spencer," David whispered. He didn't look back. His wide eyes were locked on the darkness below. His voice trembled, stripping away all of his professional composure. "You need to come here, right now." Charles felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce his veins. The island had been monitored by 24-hour security and advanced motion sensors for 28 years. A breach was physically impossible. Yet, as he stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the wet grass, the foundational logic of his reality began to fracture. He peered into the shadowed vault, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, resting perfectly in the dead center of the dark velvet drape that covered the casket. Completely free of dirt or debris was a small, tarnished silver lockbox. Charles stared at the anomalous object, his mind racing through impossibilities. It was utterly pristine, bearing the unmistakable patina of aged, high-quality silver. It did not belong here. It was a physical contradiction, a stark violation of the sacred isolation he had promised her. Someone had bypassed the unbypassable. Someone had left a secret in the dark. Charles stood frozen, his bespoke cashmere coat, a quiet testament to the immense, generational wealth of the Spencer bloodline, suddenly feeling suffocatingly heavy. He was the master of a 13,000-acre estate that had hosted kings and commanded empires for 5 centuries, yet standing over this muddy trench, all his aristocratic power felt entirely useless. Beside him, David, a top-tier engineer whose elite firm commanded millions for restoring Europe's most exclusive heritage sites, was visibly trembling. David wiped the cold sweat off his forehead, glancing nervously between the Earl and the exposed tomb. "My lord," David stammered, his voice barely rising above the idling crane. "We swept this entire perimeter with military-grade ground-penetrating radar last week. It showed solid limestone and undisturbed earth. That box, it wasn't on the scans. It's as if it evaded the frequencies entirely." "Nothing just materializes, David," Charles replied, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that betrayed his iron composure. He took a slow, dangerous step closer to the edge. As Charles stared down at the tarnished silver, a visceral flash of memory seized him, tearing him away from the present. He was suddenly thrust back into the suffocating chaos of September 1997. The blinding flashbulbs, the crushing scent of millions of rotting lilies blanketing London, and the desperate, frantic hours before the final seal was placed on this very island. He remembered Thomas, the fiercely loyal head groundskeeper who had served the Spencer family for 40 years, fiercely protective of Diana since she was a child, running through the estate's vast halls. The night before the burial, Charles had caught the old man lingering by the library doors, his calloused hands nervously clutching a small, heavy object wrapped in a dark velvet cloth. When Charles had asked what he was holding, Thomas had quickly shoved it deep into his coat, refusing to meet his eyes, muttering only about preparing a final comfort for the girl. Charles, drowning in the logistics of a global funeral, had dismissed it. But more importantly, Charles remembered that he had left the island unsupervised for exactly 10 minutes to console his grieving nephews before the masonry team arrived. 10 minutes. That was the window. Thomas had planted it. Even from a distance, Charles could now see a faint, oxidized engraving on the lid of the box. He recognized the rigid lines of the Spencer crest. But beneath it was a second, smaller etching, a delicate, cursive insignia that made his blood run absolutely cold. It was the personal cipher Diana used only for her most fiercely guarded, private correspondence. A cipher she only ever shared with one other person. "Do we halt the operation, sir?" David asked, his radio crackling loudly with confused chatter from the crew waiting on the mainland. "Should I call the authorities? The Royal Guard?" "No," Charles commanded sharply, his eyes locked on the silver lockbox, his mind racing toward a terrifying realization. "Turn off your radio. Tell your men to face the lake. No one breathes a word of this." Charles did not wait for the engineer's protests. Stripping off his bespoke cashmere coat and letting it fall carelessly into the muddy chalk of the bank, the 9th Earl Spencer gripped the cold rungs of the maintenance ladder and descended into the gaping maw of the breached vault. The temperature plummeted instantly. Down here, the air was suspended in time, heavy, damp, and carrying the faint metallic scent of ancient limestone and oxidized lead. He stepped off the ladder, his polished leather shoes sinking slightly into the silt that had begun to pool at the base of the foundation. He was mere inches from the casket. For a fleeting second, the sheer, crushing weight of his grief threatened to buckle his knees, just as it had 28 years ago when he walked behind her gun carriage. But the tarnished silver box demanded his absolute focus. He reached out with trembling hands. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, a profound realization hit him, neatly solving the engineer's frantic confusion. The box was startlingly heavy, far heavier than silver alone. It was lined with dense, high-grade lead. In the frantic, paranoid summer of 1996, during the bitter finalization of her divorce, Diana had grown increasingly terrified of surveillance. She had confided in Charles that her letters were being intercepted and her rooms bugged. To protect her most damaging correspondence, she had commissioned a private Kensington silversmith to forge 3 impenetrable lead-lined puzzle boxes that could defeat X-ray scanners. She gave one to William, kept one for herself, and told Charles the third was destroyed. Yet here it sat, completely invisible to the modern radar, because its dense core perfectly mimicked the lead lining of the coffin beneath it. Thomas the groundskeeper hadn't just hidden it, he had deployed a masterclass in espionage to honor her final wish. "My lord?" David called down, his silhouette cutting a dark shadow against the gray sky above. "Is it safe? Do not let anyone approach this trench," Charles commanded, his voice echoing sharply off the stone walls. "I am taking it to the estate." Charles ascended the ladder, clutching the silver lockbox tightly against his chest like a lifeline. He bypassed the bewildered construction crew, marching swiftly across the pontoon bridge and up the vast, manicured lawns toward Althorpe House. The heavy oak doors of the grand library groaned as he pushed them open, sealing himself inside the very room where he had last seen Thomas, nervously clutching this exact item. The silence of the cavernous, leather-bound room felt suffocating. He set the box down on his sprawling mahogany desk. There was no keyhole. Instead, the front of the box featured 3 intricate, rotating dials etched with astrological symbols. Charles swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew the sequence. It was a private joke between them from their childhood summers. Her sun sign, Cancer, his sign, Virgo, and the symbol for a new moon. His fingers slid the dials into place. Click. A sharp, mechanical release echoed through the deadly quiet of the library as the airtight seal broke. Instantly, an impossible, ghostly scent drifted into the air. The unmistakable, powdery floral notes of Quelque Fleurs, her signature perfume, perfectly preserved in the vacuum for nearly 3 decades. Tears finally breached Charles's eyes, but as he pushed the heavy lid all the way back, his sorrow instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing shock. He stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. There was a letter inside, yes, but it was what rested directly on top of the envelope that made his blood run cold. It was a piece of jewelry that the royal family had officially declared destroyed in a fire 30 years ago, an item that proved she knew exactly what was going to happen in Paris. Charles stared at the object resting atop the thick, cream-colored envelope, his breath catching painfully in his throat. It was the sovereign's platinum cipher, a miniature, heavily jeweled signet used exclusively to authorize the monarchy's most deeply classified, off-the-books directives. According to every official historical record, this priceless artifact was completely melted down to unidentifiable slag during the catastrophic Windsor Castle fire in November of 1992. The Royal Archives had formally declared it lost to the ashes. Yet here it was, perfectly intact, gleaming with a cold, terrifying brilliance under the library's antique chandelier. How could she possibly possess it? The logic snapped into place with a sickening jolt, pulling Charles into a vivid, heavily guarded memory. He remembered visiting her at Kensington Palace, just days after that devastating 1992 fire. She had been exhausted, her hands lightly bandaged from supposedly helping staff carry priceless oil paintings out of the burning corridors. When the royal aides had briefly left the room, she had flashed him a dangerously triumphant smile, pointing to a small, heavy bulge in her coat pocket. "They think the fire took their secrets, Charles," she had whispered, her eyes dark with a sudden, terrifying clarity. "But I am taking the fire." At the time, he thought she was speaking in metaphors, expressing her deep frustration with the suffocating royal machine. He had completely underestimated her. She hadn't just saved art that night. She had successfully stolen the crown's most heavily guarded symbol of absolute authority in the midst of the chaos. She knew even then, 5 long years before Paris, that a brutal war of survival was coming. She knew the establishment would eventually try to silence her, and she had systematically armed herself with the ultimate leverage. She was never the fragile, tragic pawn the media painted her to be. She was a master strategist, moving unseen pieces on a deadly chessboard right under their noses. With a trembling hand, Charles carefully lifted the heavy platinum cipher, placing it reverently on the leather blotter of his desk. Beneath it lay the letter. The thick cotton stock paper was immaculate, completely shielded from time, moisture, and the probing eyes of the world. The ink was a deep, custom-mixed sapphire blue. His eyes immediately recognized the sweeping, energetic loops of her handwriting. The sprawling library felt suddenly freezing as he slid his silver letter opener beneath the wax seal, which, he noted with a chilling realization, had been stamped using the very platinum cipher she had stolen. The institution's own absolute, unquestionable authority was sealing her final, hidden words. He unfolded the heavy parchment. The first sentence did not offer the gentle, loving farewell of a woman making peace with a tragic, unavoidable fate. Instead, the words struck him like a physical blow, instantly shattering the 30-year narrative of the tragic princess. "Dearest Charles," the letter began, the sapphire ink seemingly vibrating with urgency. "If you are reading this, it means the crash in Paris was not an accident, and I have officially lost the game. But I did not leave the boys defenseless. You must find the vault in Geneva before they do." Charles felt the vast room spin. Geneva? Charles collapsed into the high-backed leather chair behind his sprawling desk, the thick parchment trembling violently in his grip. The crash in Paris was not an accident. For nearly 3 decades, the world had swallowed the bitter, agonizing narrative of a drunk driver, a blinding flash of paparazzi cameras, and a tragic, random twist of fate. But here, written in her own steady hand, weeks before that devastating night, was the terrifying proof that she knew the hunters were closing in. His mind raced backward, desperately patching together the fractured memories of their final summer. He suddenly remembered a bizarre, fleeting phone call in late August of 1997. She had called him from a yacht in the Mediterranean, the satellite connection thick with static and ocean wind. She hadn't spoken of romance or holidays. Instead, she had cryptically asked if he still remembered the name of their late father's private Swiss wealth manager, a fiercely loyal, discreet man named Henri, who utterly despised the British establishment. At the time, Charles had brushed it off as a mundane financial inquiry, assuming she was just securing her divorce settlement. He had been so terribly blind. She wasn't managing her alimony. She was quietly building an impenetrable fortress for her sons, completely off the grid. Charles forced his wide eyes back to the sapphire ink, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The establishment believes they have stripped me of everything, Charles," the letter continued, a fierce, protective urgency radiating from the page. "They took my Royal Highness title, they stripped my security, and they think they have permanently severed my influence over the boys' future. But I used the platinum cipher you now hold to quietly bypass their treasury. Over the last 4 years, I have been moving the true leverage out of London. Documents. audio tapes, proof, things that will ensure William and Harry will never be used as pawns in the firm's machine. "Dear God, Diana," Charles whispered into the suffocating silence of the library, a profound, crushing sorrow mixing with a sudden, fierce awe. She had played the ultimate, deadly long game. While the tabloid press ruthlessly mocked her public missteps, she was secretly, methodically dismantling the institution's control over her children. The letter detailed exactly what he needed to do. Henri the banker was dead, but the Geneva vault remained locked and completely frozen in time, waiting only for the physical platinum cipher to be presented. "Do not trust anyone," her final paragraph warned, the ink pressing so hard into the cotton stock that it nearly tore the paper. "If they learn this lockbox survived the burial, they will stop at nothing to intercept you. You must go to Switzerland alone, Charles. You are the only blood I have left to finish this." Charles carefully folded the letter, a heavy, dangerous resolve hardening his features. The overwhelming grief that had defined his life since 1997 vanished, replaced by the militant duty of a brother going to war. He reached for the cipher, intending to lock it in his own secure wall safe before booking a private jet to Geneva. But before his fingers could grasp the cold jewels, the heavy brass handle of the locked library doors violently rattled. Charles froze, his blood running entirely cold. He had explicitly dismissed all the house staff for the morning. The engineers were strictly contained to the perimeter of the lake. The heavy doors rattled again, much harder this time, followed by a sharp, aggressive knock that echoed through the cavernous room. "Lord Spencer," a crisp, chillingly familiar voice called out from the corridor, a voice that belonged to a ruthless man who had officially retired from the Royal Security Detail over 2 decades ago. "Open the door. We know exactly what you just pulled out of the lake." The heavy brass handles of the library doors rattled again, the violent metallic clatter shattering the sacred quiet of the room. Charles's mind raced, a cold, predatory survival instinct instantly overriding his grief. He knew that voice. Even muffled through 3 inches of solid, antique oak, the chilling, aristocratic baritone belonged to Alistair Sterling, the former director of Royal Protection. Sterling was the exact man who had ruthlessly orchestrated the stripping of Diana's official security detail in the bitter winter of 1996, leaving her vulnerable in Paris just months later. But how was Sterling here? How did he know about a lockbox pulled from the earth less than 15 minutes ago? The sickening logic clicked into place, pulling Charles back to the muddy banks of the oval lake. He remembered David, the terrified lead engineer, his radio loudly crackling with confused chatter from the mainland crew before Charles had ordered it shut off. Sterling hadn't magically materialized. He had been waiting. For years, the royal establishment must have been quietly monitoring the structural subsidence of the Althorpe Island, knowing that eventually the earth would fail and the tomb would have to be breached. They had planted a mole within the elite engineering firm, waiting 28 years for the exact moment the limestone was moved. "I know you are in there, Charles." Sterling's voice slithered beneath the heavy door, calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "If you force my men to breach this door, the tabloid press will have aerial photos of a raid on Althorpe before noon. Think of the boys. Open it." Charles moved with a terrifying, silent speed. He snatched the heavy platinum cipher and the sapphire-inked letter from the leather blotter. He didn't use the wall safe. That was too obvious, a decoy meant for common thieves. Instead, he reached under the heavy mahogany desk, his fingers expertly finding a hidden, spring-loaded panel built by his grandfather during the Blitz of London. He shoved the artifacts into the dark cavity, sliding the panel shut, just as the library doors violently buckled under the weight of someone kicking the oak frame. Charles smoothed his waistcoat, burying his panic beneath a mask of absolute, aristocratic ice. He walked to the doors and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling them open with a sharp, commanding jerk. Alistair Sterling stood in the corridor, flanked by two men in immaculate, unmarked dark suits. Sterling had aged. His hair was completely silver now, his face lined with the deep stress of holding an empire's secrets, but his eyes remained dead, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy. "You are trespassing on private property, Alistair," Charles said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I suggest you leave before I have the estate guards remove you by force." "Don't play the offended Earl with me, Charles. Your guards are currently being detained at the main gate," Sterling replied smoothly, stepping past Charles into the sprawling library without a shred of hesitation. His cold eyes instantly locked onto the tarnished, open silver lockbox, sitting empty on the desk. A cruel, triumphant smile crept across his weathered face. "She always was theatrical," Sterling murmured, picking up the empty silver box. "We knew she stole something from the Windsor Ashes in '92. We just didn't know how she smuggled it out of London. Hiding it inside her own grave. Brilliant, really. But where is the cipher, Charles?" "I have no idea what you are talking about," Charles lied, his posture completely rigid, refusing to look toward the hidden compartment. That box was empty. A sick prank by a former groundskeeper. Sterling sighed, gently placing the silver box back down. He turned to face Charles, all traces of amusement vanishing from his cold eyes. "I really hoped you would be reasonable. But if you will not give me what she stole, I suppose I will just have to make a phone call to California. Tell me, Charles, how quickly do you think a coordinated, fatal accident could be arranged on the Pacific Coast Highway tonight?" Charles's blood turned to absolute ice. They were targeting Harry. The threat against Harry hung in the dead silence of the library, heavy and suffocating. Charles stared into Alistair Sterling's dead, calculating eyes, the aristocratic ice in his own veins turning to blazing, white-hot fury. He knew the former spymaster wasn't bluffing. A sickening flash of memory dragged Charles back to the bitter winter of 1994, paralyzing him with its dark logic. He remembered a fiercely loyal Royal Protection officer who had gotten dangerously close to uncovering the tapped phone lines at Kensington Palace. That young officer had died in a gruesome high-speed motorcycle crash just days later. A crash Sterling's office had miraculously swept under the rug as a tragic loss of control before the local police could even finish their forensic reports. Sterling had orchestrated death before to protect the establishment's darkest secrets. He would not hesitate to manufacture a fatal tragedy for a renegade prince living under the California sun. "You wouldn't dare," Charles whispered, though his trembling hands betrayed the sudden, terrifying realization that they absolutely would. "The world watches his every move, Alistair. You touch Harry, and the entire institution burns to the ground." "Sports car brakes fail on the Pacific Coast Highway all the time, Charles," Sterling replied, with a chilling, hollow calmness, casually adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "It would be a global tragedy, of course, a devastating, poetic parallel to his mother's fate. The public would weep, the media would lay flowers, and in 2 weeks, the ultimate threat to the crown would be permanently erased. Now, I will ask you one final time. Where is the platinum cipher?" Charles's mind raced, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he found himself trapped in a deadly, impossible corner. If he handed over the cipher, the Geneva vault, and the explosive, world-altering truth Diana had died to protect, would fall directly into the hands of the very men who hunted her. If he refused, his youngest nephew would be dead before midnight. The crushing weight of the choice threatened to completely break his spirit. But as Charles backed slowly against the heavy mahogany desk, his fingers subtly grazing the hidden wooden panel beneath the edge, a sudden, brilliant realization sparked in his mind. The silversmith. Diana hadn't just commissioned one lead-lined box in 1996. She had ordered 3. She had given one to William, kept one for herself, and told Charles III was destroyed. But what if she hadn't destroyed it? What if she had given it to Henri, the fiercely loyal Swiss banker, to serve as the ultimate failsafe? Charles realized he didn't have to win a physical fight. He just had to engineer a flawless deception. "You are 28 years too late, Alistair," Charles said, his voice suddenly dropping its panic, replaced by a cold, victorious sneer that echoed his sister's legendary defiance. The box in the tomb was never meant to hold the cipher. It was just a relay, a dead man's switch. Sterling frowned, his immaculate, terrifying composure fracturing for a fraction of a second. A switch for what? She didn't leave the cipher in a muddy grave, Charles lied, his eyes burning with absolute, unwavering conviction. She sent it to Geneva 28 years ago, and the release mandate was tied to the structural breach of the tomb. Sterling's face went completely white. But before the aging spy master could issue a frantic command to his thugs, the ancient grandfather clock in the corner of the library began to chime, perfectly masking the sharp, metallic click of Charles pressing a hidden brass button under the desk, a button that triggered the estate's brutal, Blitz-era steel lockdown shutters, violently slamming down over the windows and plunging the sprawling library into absolute, blinding darkness. The violent crash of the heavy steel blackout shutters hitting the floorboards echoed like thunder, plunging the cavernous library into pitch-black chaos. Sterling's thugs shouted in blind panic, the frantic sounds of scuffling feet and drawn weapons cutting through the sudden darkness. Charles did not freeze. While these men were trained for modern espionage, Charles was the bloodline master of a 500-year-old house. A vivid, desperate childhood memory instantly guided his movements. During the rolling winter blackouts of the 1970s, he and Diana used to play terrifying games of hide-and-seek in this exact room. She had been the one to show him that if you traced the edge of the sprawling Persian rug to the western wall, you would find the hidden iron latch behind the massive 16th-century tapestry, a forgotten servant's passage built by their ancestors to escape religious persecution. Operating purely on muscle memory, Charles's hand shot beneath the desk in the dark, snatching the platinum cipher and the sapphire-inked letter from the spring-loaded cavity. He dropped to his knees silently, slipping under the desperately grasping arms of a blinded thug. He crawled frantically toward the western wall, the heavy wool of the antique rug burning his palms. Behind him, he heard a heavy thud and a vicious, breathless curse as Alistair Sterling tripped over a leather armchair. "Lock down the estate!" Sterling roared, his icy, aristocratic composure entirely shattered. "Shoot him if you have to. He cannot leave this house." Charles's fingers brushed the freezing stone wall, desperately feeling for the heavy brocade edge of the tapestry. He found it. Pressing his shoulder hard against the hidden wooden panel, he tumbled forward into the narrow, suffocatingly tight stone corridor, just as the library's emergency backup lights violently flickered to life. He slammed the secret door shut, throwing the rusted iron deadbolt just as heavy, furious fists began to pound against the other side. He was trapped in the damp, freezing dark of the passage, but he was moving. He sprinted down the uneven stone steps, his lungs burning with the metallic taste of dust. He knew this tunnel bypassed the heavily monitored main gates entirely, emptying directly into a subterranean maintenance garage near the estate's outer forestry perimeter. The emotional gravity of the moment threatened to overwhelm his racing heart. Diana had saved his life with a childhood game, just as she was using him to save her son's futures from beyond the grave. Bursting into the dimly lit, cavernous garage, Charles completely ignored his fleet of modern luxury sedans. Instead, he sprinted toward an unregistered, battered 1980s Land Rover Defender used purely by the gamekeepers. He bypassed the ignition with a pocket knife, a rebellious, off-grid trick a teenage Harry had gleefully shown him years ago, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. He smashed through the wooden rear maintenance doors, tearing out into the dense, ancient woods of the estate, completely invisible to Sterling's men guarding the paved main road. With one hand aggressively steering the roaring vehicle through the muddy, treacherous terrain, Charles pulled out a secure satellite phone. He dialed his private pilot at the local, unmonitored airfield. "Have the engines running immediately. File a dummy flight plan to Paris, but set the actual coordinates for Switzerland. We leave in 10 minutes, Charles ordered, his voice vibrating with absolute, terrifying resolve. Hours later, the towering, pitch-black peaks of the Swiss Alps loomed outside the frosted window of his private jet. But as Charles finally stepped off the plane, onto the freezing tarmac of Geneva, clutching the platinum cipher in his coat pocket, his burner phone violently vibrated. It was a single, encrypted text message from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he read the screen. Sterling didn't fall for the bluff. "The bank is compromised. Do not go to the vault." The freezing wind howling off Lake Geneva bit violently through Charles's thin suit as he stood on the desolate tarmac, the encrypted message burning into his mind. "The bank is compromised. Do not go to the vault." For a terrifying second, Charles thought Alistair Sterling had won. He imagined the ruthless spymaster's assassins waiting in the shadows of the Swiss financial district, ready to bury Diana's final secret forever. But before panic could entirely consume him, a sleek, unmarked black sedan tore across the runway, its tires screeching against the frost as it slid to a halt just inches from him. The heavily tinted rear window rolled down, revealing a face that instantly brought Charles's racing heart to a dead stop. It was William. The future King of England looked older, his jaw set with an iron, unyielding resolve that mirrored his mother's legendary defiance. He pushed the door open. "Get in, Uncle Charles," William commanded softly, his eyes scanning the dark perimeter. "Sterling's men are tearing apart the commercial banks downtown. We aren't going there." As the sedan sped away into the winding, treacherous mountain roads, the fragmented pieces of a 28-year-old puzzle finally locked together in Charles's mind. He stared at his nephew, remembering the first lead-lined box Diana had commissioned in 1996. "You knew," Charles whispered, the sheer magnitude of the revelation leaving him breathless. "You've known about the failsafe this entire time." "She gave me my box a week before Paris," William replied, his voice thick with a heavy, tightly controlled grief. "It contained a single letter. It told me that if the establishment ever came for our family, I was to wait for the day the Althorpe Island failed. She promised me that you would bring the key." William reached into his heavy winter coat, pulling out a small, intricately carved wooden puzzle box. The true Geneva vault, safeguarded by Henri the banker's family and handed directly to William hours ago. At its center was a distinctly shaped indentation. With trembling hands, Charles pulled the stolen platinum cipher from his pocket. The heavy, jeweled seal gleamed in the dim light of the car. He handed it to William. The prince pressed the cipher into the wooden cavity. A sharp, incredibly satisfying mechanical click echoed through the quiet cabin as the lid popped open. Inside rested a stack of perfectly preserved microcassettes and heavily redacted financial ledgers, the undeniable, explosive proof of the establishment's darkest operations, entirely capable of destroying Sterling and crippling the very machine that had hunted her. Charles leaned back against the leather seat, a profound, overwhelming wave of peace, finally washing away the bitter agony of the last 3 decades. The media had spent 28 years painting Princess Diana as a tragic, broken victim who was swallowed by an institution too powerful to fight. But as Charles looked at William, armed with the ultimate leverage to protect his brother and his bloodline forever, he realized the magnificent truth. Diana hadn't just survived the fire of 1992. She had harnessed it. She had outplayed kings, spy masters, and empires from beyond the grave. proving that the fiercest, most unstoppable force on earth was never the crown. It was a mother's love.